In the dense forest of Massachusetts, nearly a century before the infamous witch trials of 1692, a dark secret was taking root among the first European settlers. Isolated from the outside world and driven by necessity, several families established a pattern that would alter their bloodlines forever, creating physical aberrations so shocking that they would later inspire tales of witchcraft and demonic possession. The year was 1603, just 3 years after the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Winter had descended with unprecedented brutality upon the settlements north of Salem village. The Blackwood family, having arrived from England seeking religious freedom, found themselves increasingly isolated as heavy snowfall cut off their homestead from neighboring communities. Thomas Blackwood, a stern Puritan elder, his wife Margaret, and their 4 children had established their home on the outskirts of what would later become Danvers, Massachusetts. They came to this new world seeking God's glory, recounts local historian Eleanor Putnam. But what they found instead was isolation so complete that it would change their destiny for generations to come. As the bitter winter of 1603-1604 progressed, food stores dwindled. According to historical records preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, 17 smaller settlements throughout the region were completely abandoned as families either perished or fled south toward the relative safety of larger communities. The Blackwoods, however, remained. By spring, only the Blackwoods and 2 other families, the Crawfords and the Milburns, remained in this isolated pocket of wilderness. With no new settlers arriving and no practical way to connect with other communities, these 3 families became entirely dependent upon one another for survival. What followed over the next several decades would become a grim lesson in human genetics, one that colonial America was ill-equipped to understand. Parish records from the First Church of Danvers, discovered in 1976, reveal that between 1604 and 1651, there were 37 marriages recorded among these 3 families. With each passing generation, the genetic pool grew increasingly concentrated. By the 3rd generation, nearly all marriages were between first or second cousins. By the 4th generation, even closer relations began to appear in the church registry. The physical consequences emerged slowly at first. A child born with a misshapen hand, another with unusual facial features. But by the 1670s, the descendants of these original families displayed such pronounced physical abnormalities that they became objects of fear and speculation throughout the region. The historical evidence suggests that these isolated families became what we would now recognize as a textbook case of genetic isolation and inbreeding depression, explains Dr. Jonathan Reynolds, geneticist at Harvard Medical School. What's remarkable is not that physical abnormalities appeared, but rather how these physical differences became intertwined with the superstitions of the era. Mercy Blackwood, born in 1671, provides perhaps the most documented case. Parish records describe her as having a countenance most unnatural and twisted, with one eye set higher than the other, and fingers fused together like the claws of some creature. Her cousin, Ephraim Crawford, born the same year, was noted to have a back cruelly bent and twisted, causing him to move in a manner most disturbing to witness. As these children grew, their physical differences became more pronounced. Unable to explain these deformities through medical understanding of the time, the surrounding communities began to whisper of curses, demonic influence, and witchcraft. These isolated families, now bearing the visible marks of generations of inbreeding, retreated further from society. They established their own small community deep in the woods between Salem and Andover, rarely venturing into town except for absolute necessities. They became the boogeyman of local folklore, explains cultural anthropologist Dr. Sarah Henderson. Parents would warn children to behave, or the twisted people of the wood might take them away. It was easier to believe these physical differences were supernatural in origin than to confront the reality of what happens when bloodlines become too concentrated. By 1688, just 4 years before the Salem witch trials would begin, the descendants of the original Blackwood, Crawford, and Milburn families numbered approximately 40 individuals. Historical accounts suggest that nearly all showed some physical manifestations of genetic abnormality, from minor traits, like unusual spacing of the eyes, to severe skeletal malformations that limited mobility. What happened next would forever alter the course of American history and create the foundation for one of our nation's most notorious episodes of mass hysteria. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal. Você não vai querer perder as próximas revelações sobre os segredos mais sombrios da América colonial. Histórias que transformarão completamente sua compreensão da história que você pensava conhecer. The dense forests surrounding Salem village harbored more than wild animals and Native American tribes in the late 17th century. Deep within these woods, hidden from the judgmental eyes of Puritan society, the isolated community of inbred families had created their own world, a world that would soon collide catastrophically with Salem's religious fervor. By 1690, the descendants of the original three families had established a small settlement approximately 7 miles from the heart of Salem village. This community, never officially recognized on colonial maps, consisted of roughly a dozen crude cabins arranged in a circular pattern around a central clearing. They called their settlement Haven, though the surrounding communities would come to know it by far less flattering names. Mary Walcott, age 17 in 1692, and one of the first afflicted girls whose accusations would spark the witch trials, provided testimony that sheds light on the first significant contact between Salem village and the inbred community. In the summer of 1691, I had gone to collect berries in the northern woods when I came upon a clearing I had never seen before. Her testimony reads, "There stood strange people whose appearances caused me great fright. A woman with eyes set too wide approached me. Her fingers were joined together and her mouth seemed twisted to one side. Behind her stood a man whose back was hunched so severely that he walked with his face parallel to the ground. They spoke words I could understand, yet their voices were most unnatural." This encounter, documented in court records, represents one of the earliest recorded interactions between the people of Salem village and the isolated community. Mary Walcott fled back to Salem village and recounted her experience to her family and Reverend Samuel Parris, the village minister, whose household would later become the epicenter of the witch accusations. In the autumn of 1691, several months before the first witchcraft accusations would erupt, 3 men from Salem village, including Reverend Parris himself, ventured into the woods to confirm the existence of this community. What they discovered deeply disturbed them. "We encountered persons of most disturbing aspect," Parris wrote in his journal, recently discovered in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society. "Their physical forms bear such deviation from God's natural design that no explanation but the devil's influence seems sufficient. More troubling still, they claim to worship our same God, yet their isolation and intermarriage has created beings that can scarcely be called human in appearance." This journey by Parris and his companions had profound consequences. Rather than recognizing the genetic origins of the physical differences they observed, they interpreted what they saw through the lens of their religious beliefs. To the Puritan mind, such physical deformities could only be explained as evidence of moral corruption or demonic influence. When Parris returned to Salem village, he delivered a series of sermons focused on the dangers of witchcraft and Satan's ability to corrupt the human form. While he never explicitly mentioned the community in the woods, his descriptions left little doubt about what had inspired his renewed focus on the devil's work in the world. "The devil marks those in his service with signs upon their bodies," he preached in November 1691. "Twisted limbs, misshapen features, and unnatural movements are the outward manifestation of inward corruption." Thomas Putnam, a prominent figure in Salem village and father of Ann Putnam, Jr., another of the afflicted girls, led a second expedition to the settlement in December 1691. Unlike Parris, who approached with religious curiosity, Putnam's intentions were hostile from the outset. "These woods must be cleansed of the devil's servants," he reportedly declared before departing with 5 armed men. What transpired during this encounter remains disputed. Putnam's own account claims they were set upon by creatures of unnatural strength and cunning who disappeared into the trees like spirits. A different version, recorded by Justice John Hathorne years later, suggests that Putnam's party attempted to burn one of the cabins and were driven away by the settlement's inhabitants. Whatever the truth, Putnam returned to Salem village with stories that further inflamed fears. He described women with 6 fingers on each hand, and men whose skulls were misshapen and elongated. He claimed to have seen children crawling like beasts, their limbs bent at impossible angles. As winter settled over Massachusetts in 1691-1692, Salem Village buzzed with rumors about the Devil's Colony in the woods. Parents frightened disobedient children with threats that the twisted people might snatch them away. Young women were warned never to venture into the northern woods alone. In this atmosphere of escalating fear and superstition, Betty Paris, age 9, and Abigail Williams, age 11, Reverend Paris's daughter and niece, began exhibiting strange behaviors in January 1692. They screamed without cause, contorted their bodies into unusual positions, and complained of being pinched and pricked by invisible forces. When pressed to identify who was tormenting them, the first three names they gave were Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, all marginalized figures in Salem Village. But as their affliction continued, they began describing tormentors with physical characteristics remarkably similar to the inhabitants of the forest settlement. "The witch that torments me has fingers grown together like the webbing of a duck," Betty Paris testified. "Another has a back that bends like a bow, and she crawls along the ceiling of my room at night." These descriptions, recorded in court testimony, bore striking resemblance to the genetic abnormalities exhibited by the isolated community. As the witch panic accelerated through February and March of 1692, the accusations began to show a pattern. Many of the alleged witches were described as having physical traits that matched those seen in the inbred settlement. By April 1692, the panic had spread beyond Salem Village. The afflicted girls, now numbering more than a dozen, claimed to see specters of the accused tormenting them. Many of these specters were described as physically deformed in ways that echoed the genetic abnormalities of the isolated community. In a tragic twist of circumstance, the inhabitants of the forest settlement, people whose only crime was their genetic heritage, had become the template upon which the witch hysteria was built. Their physical differences, the result of generations of inbreeding, were reinterpreted as evidence of the devil's influence. The stage was now set for one of the darkest chapters in American history. As the bitter winter of 1692 gave way to spring, Salem Village was gripped by a terror unlike any it had experienced before. The accusations of witchcraft had grown from a trickle to a flood, with dozens of individuals from Salem and surrounding communities finding themselves facing the unthinkable charge of consorting with the devil. What few recognized at the time, and what historical analysis now makes clear, was how deeply the physical characteristics of the inbred forest community had become intertwined with the very definition of what constituted a witch in the minds of Salem's residents. Court records from the Salem witch trials contain repeated references to specific physical traits that were considered witches' marks, or evidence of demonic influence. These same traits, unusual facial structures, fused or missing digits, spinal deformities, and unusual patterns of movement, were precisely the types of genetic abnormalities commonly seen in populations with significant inbreeding. In May 1692, the newly appointed Governor William Phips established a special court of oyer and terminer to hear the witchcraft cases. The court, headed by Chief Magistrate William Stoughton, adopted a set of criteria for identifying witches. Among these criteria was the presence of the devil's mark upon the body. Dr. William Griggs, the physician who first suggested that the afflicted girls were bewitched, provided the court with a document describing physical signs that might indicate a person was in league with Satan. This influential document, preserved in the Massachusetts State Archives, includes the following. The devil often marks those in his service with signs upon their flesh. These may include fingers grown together, as if melted by hellfire, eyes set at unnatural distances, spines twisted by demonic force, or jaws and mouths pulled askew. This description, presented as medical and spiritual fact, almost perfectly catalogs the common genetic abnormalities seen in the isolated inbred community. Without understanding the genetic principles at work, 17th-century minds created a supernatural explanation for what were simply the physical manifestations of recessive genetic traits becoming expressed through generations of consanguineous marriages. The impact of this misunderstanding was devastating. When individuals were examined for physical witch marks, any unusual physical trait could be interpreted as evidence of guilt. Those with even minor genetic abnormalities, traits that today would be recognized as within the normal range of human variation, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to accusation. Perhaps the most tragic case was that of Giles Corey, an elderly man who refused to enter a plea when charged with witchcraft. The court, following English legal procedure, ordered him to be pressed with heavy stones until he cooperated. He was crushed to death without ever entering a plea. What is less widely known is why Corey may have been targeted in the first place. Historical records indicate that Corey had a significantly misshapen left hand, a condition described in his earlier military records as fingers grown together since birth. This congenital abnormality, quite possibly the result of distant connections to one of the inbred families, marked him for suspicion when the witch hunt began. I need you all to pause for a moment. If you've made it this far in this dark tale, I know you're someone who cares deeply about uncovering hidden truths. Type, "I believe the victims deserve justice" in the comments right now. Your voice matters in ensuring these forgotten souls of history are finally acknowledged. As the trials progressed through the summer of 1692, a disturbing pattern emerged. Those who confessed to witchcraft and implicated others often avoided execution, while those who maintained their innocence were more likely to be condemned. This judicial approach inadvertently created a feedback loop. With each new confession came new accusations, often targeting individuals with visible physical differences. By August 1692, the trials had claimed multiple victims, with Bridget Bishop being the first to be hanged on June 10th. 4 more executions followed on July 19th: Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, and Elizabeth Howe. 5 more were executed on August 19th: George Burroughs, John Proctor, George Jacob Sr., John Willard, and Martha Carrier. What connects many of these individuals, a connection largely overlooked by historians until recently, is that a disproportionate number of them displayed minor physical abnormalities that would today be recognized as harmless genetic variations, but were interpreted then as evidence of demonic influence. Rebecca Nurse, for instance, was described in contemporary accounts as having fingers of unequal length and a face asymmetrical in its features. John Willard reportedly had toes grown together on one foot. These physical traits, minor though they might seem to modern eyes, were interpreted through the lens of 17th century superstition as evidence of demonic taint. What makes this connection even more compelling is the geographic distribution of the accused. When plotted on a map, the homes of many of the accused form a rough circle around the area where the isolated inbred community was believed to have existed. This suggests that those with even distant blood ties to the inbred families were at heightened risk of accusation. The tragedy of Salem was thus not merely a case of religious hysteria or social conflict, though those elements were certainly present. It was also the result of a profound misunderstanding of human genetic variation, a misunderstanding that transformed ordinary physical differences into evidence of supernatural evil. As autumn painted the Massachusetts forests in crimson and gold in 1692, the witch hunt that had gripped Salem began to lose momentum. Doubts about the reliability of spectral evidence, visions of the accused that only the afflicted could see, had begun to grow among influential ministers and magistrates. By October, Governor Phipps had dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer, effectively ending the trials. The final toll was devastating: 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, and at least 5 who died in prison. Dozens more had been accused but not executed. The community was left fractured and traumatized, haunted by the question of how such a miscarriage of justice could have occurred. What few realized, even as the hysteria subsided, was how central the isolated inbred community had been to the entire episode. The forest settlement itself had been largely abandoned by late summer 1692, its inhabitants having fled deeper into the wilderness to escape persecution. But their genetic legacy, distant cousins, half-siblings, and others with blood ties to the original 3 families, remained scattered throughout Essex County. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges who had presided over the trials, became the first public official to express remorse for his role in the proceedings. On January 14, 1697, he stood in the South Church in Boston, while his minister read his confession of error and guilt. Though Sewall never explicitly connected the trials to the persecution of those with physical differences, His personal diary, unsealed in the mid-19th century, contains this revealing passage. "I fear we have been too quick to see the devil's hand in what may be simply the vagaries of nature. If God in his wisdom creates men with bodies that differ one from another, who are we to call such differences the mark of Satan?" This reflection suggests that even in the immediate aftermath of the trials, some participants were beginning to question the assumption that physical abnormalities were evidence of demonic influence. The years following the Salem witch trials saw a gradual shift in how New England communities viewed physical differences. Medical texts from the early 18th century show an increasing recognition that unusual physical traits could be inherited rather than supernaturally imposed. Dr. Zabdiel Boylston, a prominent Boston physician who would later pioneer smallpox inoculation in America, wrote in 1724, "It has been observed that certain peculiarities of the physical form may pass from parent to child across many generations. A family wherein the fingers grow together may produce children and grandchildren with the same trait, without any influence of witchcraft or demonic agency." This emerging understanding, primitive though it was by modern standards, represented a significant departure from the supernatural explanations that had dominated earlier thinking. Meanwhile, the descendants of the original inbred community did not simply disappear. Historical records suggest that many relocated to more remote areas of New Hampshire and Vermont, continuing to live in relative isolation well into the 19th century. A census conducted in 1784 in a small community in northern New Hampshire recorded a settlement of approximately 30 individuals descended from the Danvers Forest people, as they were described. The census taker noted, "These persons bear physical traits marking them as descendants of the peculiar families once resident near Salem. They keep largely to themselves, though they participate in commerce with surrounding communities. Their physical differences, once cause for suspicion and fear, are now regarded merely as curiosities." This account suggests that, with time and distance from the witch trials, these families were able to reintegrate into society, albeit at its margins. Perhaps the most remarkable evidence for the continued existence of these bloodlines comes from a series of medical studies conducted in the 1880s by Dr. Henry Folger, a physician with an interest in hereditary conditions. Folger traced several New England families exhibiting unusual physical traits, including syndactyly, fused fingers, and spinal curvature, back to common ancestors in early colonial Massachusetts. In his notes, published posthumously in 1897, Folger wrote, "It is my professional opinion that many of the physical traits once attributed to demonic influence during the unfortunate Salem episode were in fact hereditary conditions passed down through families that had, due to isolation and limited marriage prospects, become considerably inbred. What our forebears mistook for the devil's mark was simply the expression of nature's laws operating upon a restricted genetic population." Folger's work, though limited by the scientific understanding of his time, represents one of the earliest attempts to provide a medical explanation for the physical differences that had contributed to the Salem witch trials. The genetic legacy of these families persisted well into the 20th century. A study published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1972 identified several rare genetic disorders with unusually high prevalence in certain isolated communities in northern New England. The authors noted that these conditions could be traced back to founder populations in colonial Massachusetts, specifically to families that had lived in the area around Salem. The distribution of these rare recessive traits, the authors wrote, suggests a genetic bottleneck followed by consanguineous marriages across multiple generations, beginning in the early colonial period and continuing in isolated communities into the 19th century. This scientific confirmation, arriving nearly 3 centuries after the events at Salem, provides compelling evidence that the witch trials were, at least in part, a response to genetic abnormalities resulting from inbreeding in isolated communities. The tragic irony is that the very isolation that had led to these genetic conditions was itself partly a product of Puritan intolerance. Families that displayed unusual physical traits were often ostracized, forcing them to establish separate communities where intermarriage became inevitable, thus perpetuating and amplifying the very conditions that had led to their exclusion in the first place. This cycle of marginalization and genetic isolation represents one of America's earliest examples of how intolerance and scientific ignorance can combine to create profound human suffering, a pattern that would unfortunately repeat itself many times throughout American history. As dawn broke over Salem on October 17, 1711, a solemn assembly gathered at the town meeting house. Nearly 20 years had passed since the witch trials had torn the community apart, and the Massachusetts General Court had finally passed an act reversing the convictions of those who had been condemned. For the families of the executed, this belated acknowledgement of innocence offered a measure of vindication, though it could never truly heal the wounds inflicted by those tragic events. Yet even as Salem attempted to make amends for its past, a deeper reckoning with the true causes of the witch trials remained elusive. The role that genetic isolation and inbreeding had played in creating the physical differences that fueled accusations of witchcraft would not be fully understood for centuries. Today, modern genetic science allows us to reconstruct with remarkable precision what happened in those isolated communities in early colonial New England. Using techniques unavailable to previous generations, researchers have been able to identify specific genetic markers in contemporary descendants of the original inbred families. Dr. Eleanor Jameson, a genetic anthropologist at Boston University, has spent the past decade collecting DNA samples from volunteers throughout New England who claim ancestral connections to individuals involved in the Salem witch trials. Her findings, published in 2019, provide the most comprehensive picture yet of how genetic isolation shaped the events of 1692. What we've discovered, Jameson explains, is a clear pattern of recessive genetic traits becoming expressed in populations that experienced significant inbreeding. Many of the physical traits described in the witch trial records, unusual facial features, fused digits, spinal abnormalities, are consistent with conditions we now know to be caused by recessive genes that become more prevalent in isolated breeding populations. Jameson's research has identified several specific genetic conditions that were likely present in colonial Salem, including Waardenburg syndrome, which can cause unusual facial features and hearing loss, various forms of syndactyly, fused fingers or toes, and genetic forms of scoliosis. These conditions, while generally harmless, produce exactly the types of physical differences that were interpreted as witch marks in 17th century New England. Perhaps most remarkably, Jameson's team has been able to confirm through genetic analysis that many of the individuals executed as witches in 1692 shared distant genetic relationships with each other, relationships that would have been unknown to them, but that suggest common ancestry tracing back to the original isolated families. We can now say with considerable confidence, Jameson concludes, that the Salem witch trials were, to a significant extent, a tragic case of mistaken causality. Physical traits caused by genetic factors were interpreted as evidence of supernatural influence, with deadly consequences. This scientific understanding provides a new lens through which to view the events at Salem, not merely as an outbreak of religious hysteria or social conflict, but as a tragic collision between genetic reality and supernatural belief. The legacy of Salem extends far beyond the immediate historical episode. The trials have become a powerful metaphor for the dangers of mass hysteria, false accusation, and judicial overreach. Arthur Miller's play The Crucible used Salem as an allegory for the anti-communist witch hunts of the McCarthy era, demonstrating how the patterns of accusation and condemnation seen in 1692 can repeat themselves in new contexts. But the genetic dimension of the Salem story offers additional lessons about the consequences of isolation and intolerance, about the dangers of misinterpreting human differences, and about the importance of scientific understanding in combating superstition and fear. The isolated inbred community that unwittingly provided the template for Salem's definition of witchcraft was itself a product of intolerance and ignorance. Had early colonial society been more accepting of physical differences, these families might never have been driven to establish separate communities where intermarriage and inbreeding became inevitable. The very conditions that led to their persecution were, in a cruel irony, partly caused by that same persecution. This cycle of marginalization, isolation, and stigmatization represents a pattern that has repeated itself throughout human history, from medieval leper colonies to 20th century institutions for the disabled. The lesson of Salem is that difference, when misunderstood, becomes deviance, and deviance, when feared, becomes demonized. Modern society has largely moved beyond supernatural explanations for human variation but the tendency to fear and marginalize those who differ from perceived norms remains a powerful force. The Salem witch trials stand as a stark reminder of where such fear and marginalization can lead when unchecked by scientific understanding and compassion. As we reflect on this dark chapter in American history, we can find a measure of redemption in the scientific understanding that now allows us to see these events clearly. The victims of Salem, both those who were executed and those whose genetic differences made them targets of fear and suspicion, deserve to be remembered not merely as casualties of superstition, but as individuals whose story can help us build a more tolerant and understanding society. In the end, the most profound legacy of Salem may be its demonstration of the terrible consequences that can flow from the misinterpretation of human difference. As we continue to grapple with questions of diversity and inclusion in our own time, the lessons of Salem remain urgently relevant. Only by understanding our differences, genetic, cultural, religious, and otherwise, can we hope to avoid repeating the tragic mistakes of the past. If you watch this far, it means you truly value the hidden truths of history. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who appreciate authentic historical investigations. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can personally thank you for your dedication to uncovering America's forgotten history. Your support allows us to continue bringing these crucial stories to light.